And we will move on now to Ms. Thomas for the Conservative Party for 5 minutes.
JJ, you wrote a column in the New York Times a little while ago in April, and in it you said, I quote, "An act of an authoritarian-minded government seeking greater control over independent media for purely ideological purposes in a globally unprecedented reimagining of the state's right to control online content, justified only by an imperious assertion that politicians and bureaucrats should decide what their citizenry needs to see. If passed, Bill C-11 will serve only to empower other regimes that believe the unrestricted freedom to choose what we watch and hear is a monster to be slain," end quote. Do you care to elaborate on this?
Yes, that's some good rhetoric on my part, isn't it? No, I mean, when we hear, it was in the Washington Post, just for the record, when we hear some of this rhetoric, I do think it disturbs some people. When we hear stuff about how we have to protect ourselves from foreign domination and we have to maintain our cultural sovereignty, the idea that, Canadian culture is this fragile thing that the evil foreigners are going to corrupt and sort of erode us. That to me is the kind of rhetoric you associate with Viktor Orban's Hungary or something, right? And I don't think that a progressive democratic country like Canada wants to set the roadmap to regulating the internet that can then be adopted by the Viktor Orbans of the world. Because what's to prevent an authoritarian government from sort of saying well, we want to protect our cultural sovereignty too, and that's why we need to regulate YouTube and make sure that only good patriotic, content is seen, and we'll, play around with the algorithm to ensure that only the sort of patriotic content that we believe our people should see will get boosted in their feeds and their subscriber counts and all that kind of stuff. This is a real sort of old-fashioned way of thinking about Canada and thinking about Canadian culture that I personally do not have a lot of time for, and I think is increasingly just a very dated premise of thinking about culture that most YouTubers just do not conceptualize in the same way. They don't think I'm making content in order to preserve some fragile idea of Canadian sovereignty. They think I'm making a cooking video, I'm making a fitness tutorial, I'm making a DIY video. I make videos that are about specifically Canadian stuff, but there's tons of Canadian YouTubers who have been successful by just making the kind of content that they think there's an audience for. Sometimes that audience is Canadian, sometimes that audience is international. But Canadians, I don't know, we're a very diverse people and we've got a lot of different interests. And I think that the great thing about YouTube and new media is that it allows Canadians to create the kind of content they want for a market that they believe exists. They sink or swim based on the popularity of that. And it's true what one of the other fellows said, which is that, there are a lot of failed Canadian YouTubers. There's a lot of failed Canadian actors. Nobody is guaranteed success in the cultural realm. But I just think that YouTube is a marvelous case study of how you can be an independent Canadian content creator and achieve, wealth and success and fame and all of the sorts of things that creatives want, without government regulation, without subsidies, without mandates and CanCon requirements and all of this kind of stuff. So what I'm sort of saying is that I do think that we need to kind of get away from this. If old media wants to still live under that regime, that's fine. But to me, as a new media creator, when I hear about talk of protecting our culture from foreign domination and how we need government sort of paternalistic hand to ensure that YouTube will be more patriotic and more Canadian and that consumers of YouTube will only watch the right sorts of videos, that kind of stuff gets my backup and gets the backup of a lot of Canadian content creators who don't want to be told what kind of content that they have to make.
JJ, what you're talking about is the desire under Bill C-11 that the government has to protect, quote, Canadian culture. Ultimately, what it means is that CanCon, anything that fits that definition, which is an antiquated definition to begin with, will be bumped up in the queue in terms of discoverability online, and other material that doesn't meet that antiquated definition will actually get bumped down and maybe even be on page 553 of the internet where it'll never be discovered in its lifetime. What impact will this have on digital-first creators?
Yeah, so this is a very important point. So in the YouTube world, we have a term where we talk about getting buried, right? YouTube has its own algorithm, which is controversial in its own terms, what makes a YouTube video easy to discover or not easy to discover. YouTube has their own sort of system of that. If government gets involved, if the CRTC gets involved and comes up with their own sort of metrics, then you've got this whole new stress to worry about. Is your video now not only getting sort of suppressed by YouTube's algorithm, but by some sort of new, content regime that the CRTC has imposed on YouTube? Is your video getting suppressed, even though it's made by a Canadian, because it's not Canadian enough by whatever the CRTC's definition of Canadian enough is. As I said in my opening statement, the CRTC makes, as I'm sure the other witnesses are well aware, they make you jump through all sorts of hoops in order to obtain what is literally called Canadian certification. Having to vow that, or having to affirm that, there was enough Canadian actors and there was enough Canadian music and it was made in Canada, as well as content stuff. These are all the hoops that you have to jump through. And
10 seconds.
I think it's a lot of Canadians are going to be oblivious to all of these hoops that they have to jump through. A lot of Canadian YouTubers are oblivious to this discussion that's even happening. So there's I worry very much that a lot of YouTubers are going to wake up one day and they're suddenly going to see their content suppressed. Suddenly they're not going to be making as much money, not getting enough views because governments intervened.
Thank you very much. And now I go